Now, I had to struggle back then to disentangle religion from race, and now I see that the whole thing is sliding back into the same old morass out of which I dragged it 15 years ago. That's why I got upset about Nick Fuentes' tweet. He's got a following among very confused 20-year-olds who have no firm identity for lots of reasons we could go into. But now the confusion has been resurrected, and someone's got to clarify the situation. And that's why I tweeted what I did.
I guess I could start by agreeing that there is a theological difference between the Jews who accepted Christ and thereby ceased to be Jews and became Christians, and the Jews who, in fact, remained what they were, which is to say, remained apostate and wicked in rejecting Christ. And so you have that division, and certainly that division is theological, because there's no difference, racially speaking, between the Jews, if we're going to use the term ethnically in this case, racially, the Israelites, the Old Testament Israelites who rejected Christ and the ones who accepted him. Certainly they are the same nation, they are the same race. But that's not really what we're talking about here, because what we're talking about here is whether or not white unity, which is to say European unity, is possible within a Christian framework. And I think that certainly that must be the case, because historically we have a great example of that. We have the Holy Roman Empire, which was essentially a unified Europe for a number of centuries under Christendom. It was in fact identical with Christendom. And so not only do we have the historical example of that being possible, but there's nothing in the Christian faith that is incompatible with nationalism or with a sort of pan-nationalism, not in the sense of erasing national boundaries, more in the sense of a federated system such as the Holy Roman Empire, in which you still had Christian Spain and Christian Germany and Christian Italy, and they weren't merged into one country. They weren't merged into one nation, certainly, because they're still distinct peoples. And so Christianity was perfectly compatible with that. There's no reason to believe that that would be different today. And so the question would be, why do you think it's incompatible? The Jews certainly are a particular case, but I don't think they're actually relevant for us here and now. They're not relevant to this actual question. They're a separate matter. They're a separate nation.
Okay, it's good. I'm glad you said that. I agree with you completely about the Holy Roman Empire. What we have to clarify right now is the ambiguous use of the word race. The way you used it is a way that I would say ethnic group. If that's what you mean by race, and this is the way the word race was used in America, let's say at the end of the 19th century. When Monsignor O'Connell wrote to Bishop Ireland about these are two Irishmen plotting to get Germans expelled from Catholic University, O'Connell said, we can't allow this to become a racial issue. We can't portray this as one race against the other. What he meant was the Irish versus the Germans. I've said before, I'm biracial in this sense of the word. I'm Irish and I'm German. So if by race you mean ethnic group, or what the Germans would call Volk, das Volk, then I agree with you completely. We have no argument. Das Volk, the ethnic group, is completely compatible with the Catholic faith. That was the great triumph of the Holy Roman Empire. It had very little to do with, it was all of these principalities. It was all of these different ethnic groups. And the one thing that united them was the Catholic faith, which allowed both unity and multiplicity at the same time. And that was the great triumph of Europe, the great triumph of European culture, of which America is a descendant. So if that's what you mean by race, I agree with you.
The great triumph of the Holy Roman Empire was that it maintained national distinctions while still enabling Europeans to cooperate as a larger racial group. Because, of course, there are larger racial groups and smaller, or we can say a certain level of refinement, depending on how we're speaking. Because, of course, you could go down to the level of, say, Bavarians. They are a subgroup of the Germans. The Germans are a racial group. The Germanics are a racial group. Europeans are a racial group. We could do the same thing in Africa or the Middle East or Asia. Of course, there are the three great racial groups, those who stepped off the ark and are descended from the sons of Noah. But specifically with regard to the issue of the terms being used, the only difference is the originating language, because ethnic, ethnos, is Greek. Race, radix, is Latin. That's the difference there. They are the same term. Now, if we wanted to get into nitpicky sort of details, we could discuss this in the same sort of context, in the same way, an analogous way to how sex and gender are used. And I know some people object to the use of gender, but I think there's a use for the term. So for instance, in the case of sex and gender, sex is a biological matter. You are male or you are female, determined by your sex chromosomes, whether you are XX female or XY male. There are people who try to bring up the fact that there are some defects. That doesn't change the reality. That's like arguing a man who's lost a leg changes the definition of human being from having two legs. No, the man with one leg is defective in that way. He deviates from the actual standard of the thing. And so with regard to sex, that is biology. With regard to gender, that is the way the biology is properly expressed. And so a woman, biologically, is properly feminine with regard to gender. And of course, a man is properly masculine. So that's the usage of those terms. The same thing is true with regard to nationality and ethnicity. Nationally speaking, racially speaking, I am largely German. I'm 88% German and 12%, roughly, genetics, Scottish. That's what I am. So we're actually fairly similar. You happen to be the other side of the channel there, my Celtic cousin. So you are Irish and German. I'm Scottish and German, mostly German though. And so that would be racially. But I am also racially American, because America is an Anglo-Saxon country with Celtic admixture. That's what America is. There are some others who have come over time. We have obviously some Italians and others now. But racially speaking, the U.S. is a white European country, specifically Germanic, because of course both the Angles and the Saxons are both Germanic. Now, ethnically speaking, I am most certainly American, because there is an ethnic expression of the nation, of the race. And so if we wanted to zoom out again to a larger scale of this, you have Germanic is a race. There are sub-races within that. You can be more specific. The Dutch and the Germans are not the same. But racially speaking, the Germanics are ethnically different with regard to those subgroups. And so to be ethnically Dutch is not the same as to be ethnically German, is not the same as to be ethnically English. But the terms, by and large, refer to the same biological blood reality. I could never be Japanese, because I am not Japanese by blood. The same thing is true if someone said I could become a woman. It's the same sort of insanity. It's an absolutely absurd claim. Nothing could ever possibly make me anything other than a man, because that is what God made me. He also made me German, Scottish, American. There's no way you can change that. So the terms are the same thing. There's no real distinction between race and ethnicity, unless we're talking about this very hyper-specific thing where a good example, honestly, is the Germans and the French, because the Germans and the French are pretty closely related biologically, but they are very different ethnically. So you have a racial group and an ethnic expression of that. But there's no effective difference there. And so if we want to speak about ethnicity and nations, we're speaking about the same thing, because a German is racially German and ethnically German.
Okay, we have the same equivocation here with the word race. We have to clarify this issue, okay, because it's the fundamental issue that we're dealing with. So when you say race, half the time you're meaning ethnic group, and half the time we're going to have to use the term here. You're talking about phenotype. If you're talking about phenotype, then race, what is phenotype? It's the agglomeration of characteristics that characterizes a particular group of people by appearance, And so the phenotype of the European is different than the phenotype of the African, for example. It's obvious. This is a category of reality. We can't get beyond it, okay? Now, there's always a sleight of hand here, where suddenly we're saying you use the same word race when you mean both phenotype and ethnic group. Okay, there is no such thing as a Germanic race. It's a Germanic ethnic group, and the ethnic groups were there in existence at the time of the Roman Empire. The Grautungi, the Suevi, and so on and so forth. They were mobilized together in a group of people, first as the Holy Roman Empire, and then with the unification of Germany in 1871, they became their own country. This is German is a language. Ethnos is based on language. Phenotype has nothing to do with language. There's always the sleight of hand where we go from phenotype to identity. Phenotype does not create identity. Okay? Phenotype is the way you look. Language creates identity. Religion creates identity. You could add in geography, custom, law. All of these things create identity, but phenotype does not do that. When did this happen? First of all, the term race is totally alien to German history. Okay? Wilhelm Schmidt wrote an article about the appearance of the word race around the end of the 19th century. It was plunked down in the middle of a German text, R-A-C-E. Well, no German knew how to pronounce that. There is no way you can pronounce that in German. And so it got transmogrified into Rasse. Rasse. Okay? And that's where Hitler picked it up. Okay? Now, this is, where did this come from? Hitler got it from Madison Grant. Madison Grant was the American racial theorist who basically said there were three types of European identity, and he only wanted to let one into him. His big success was the race laws in 1923. Where did this come from? It came from Virginia. This is race is an American invention. It was invented in Virginia in the aftermath of the Bacon's Rebellion, because in Virginia you had slaves from Africa and you had slaves from Scotland and Ireland. Okay, and in the Bacon's Rebellion, these two groups united, and it scared the shit out of the tobacco magnates in Virginia. And they never wanted this to happen again. And so they created the term white to divide the working class. This is where it came from. It's totally alien to German history and German thought. The only word that was operative in Germany was das Volk. No other word was operative. Race was never a word that was used until Hitler got the idea from Madison Grant, who got it from Virginia, where it was invented to divide the working class.
In the German context, we don't need the term race or Rasse because we have das Volke, die Volke. And so we already have the term for race because that is in fact what it means. That's what people means. That is why when Luther referenced the German people and he said, "To my dear Germans, God has sent me, them will I serve," he used the word folk because he was talking about the race. He was talking about the people. And the reason, as I already said earlier, that I am sort of equivocating with these terms, that I am conflating them, is because they are the same word. Ethnicity and race are the same thing. One is the inevitable expression of the other, just as culture is itself downstream from race. And I completely disagree, both etymologically and regard just to general biology and reality, that race was invented at some point in human history, unless we're going all the way back to the beginning, and I'll come back to that in a second. But first I'll address the etymology, because again, race comes from radix. It comes from root in Latin. There's also probably a sexual pun there with regard to rod, which is one of the other meanings of radix. And I think the gentleman who came up with that term was probably had a sense of humor. But going back to the issue of biology and reality, we're not talking about phenotype. I was certainly darker skinned when I went to the beach all the time in California. Certainly that's not exactly phenotype, but it is related to phenotype because how one tans is part of that expression. But that's not the underlying reality, because the underlying reality is the genotype, which is a word you did not use. We're not talking about pheno. We're not talking about phenine. Greek, what is that? To show. We're talking about gene. We're talking about the biological reality because your phenotype is simply an expression of your genotype. How you look is an expression of what you are because it is what you are. There's no distinction between those two. There is some variance, of course, with regard to how your phenotype is specifically expressed with regard to your underlying genotype, because obviously siblings don't look exactly identical. Even identical twins don't look exactly the same. There are some minor differences in the expression, in the phenotype. But the genotype is a different thing, because what is genotype? Genotype is a matter of biology. It is a matter of blood. And so if we go back to the creation of that, well, there's only one potential source. It has to be God, because God created all of the necessary genetic information for every human being who will ever walk this planet, and he put it in Adam. This is the fundamental thing that neo-Darwinians, whatever particular thing they're using these days, modern synthesis, whatever one they want to use, they're all nonsense. But this is the fundamental thing that they miss. There is no creation of novel information, and so you cannot have speciation in that way. You cannot have the creation of something new because that doesn't happen. It's never been demonstrated. It's philosophically impossible. It's a tangential issue, but that's not how it works. How you go from one species to something else, and usually it's a subspecies, not an actual different species, unless it's so degenerate it can no longer interbreed. Because, of course, every single race of men on this planet can produce fertile offspring. They have more or fewer problems, granted, some of them significant problems from interbreeding, but they can produce fertile offspring. So we are the same species, we are different subspecies. But the way that you get to a subspecies is the loss of genetic information. And so the way that you get from Adam to me is a loss of information over time that specifically made the Germanic race. The way that you get to an African over time is the loss of information that specifically made the African races. You cannot get back from what we have today to what they were then. The same thing is true with regard to dogs. This is an easier thing for most people to grasp with dog species. You can't take golden retrievers and Pomeranians, just the two that I happen to have, or German shepherds or a Malamute or all these dogs, and get back to the one that Noah had on the ark. The information has been lost over time, but they are distinct subspecies of the overarching dog species. In human beings, we don't call it breed, we call it race. Now, sometimes we do call it breed historically. You'll see that in older texts, but today we call it race. I am Germanic by race, which is what the American race is. It is a Germanic subrace. I am also ethnically American. Race is not something that is a construct of the mind or something that comes from philosophy. It doesn't come from human thought. It comes from God's design and creation. And we see that in Scripture as well. Because when Scripture speaks of ethnos, it is speaking of the races of men. It is speaking of nations. It is speaking of die Völker, if we wanted to use the German. That is the reality that underlies all of this.
Okay, let me say that I misspoke. Okay, when I was talking about Virginia, what I meant to say was white was created in Virginia. White as a designation for human beings was created in Virginia. It was never used before that time. You can look it up in the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. First time it got used in a play is the beginning of the 17th century. That's what was written into law in Virginia. The citizens of Virginia had to be white. Okay, white is phenotype. Okay, it's not genotype, it's phenotype. They didn't have any understanding of what genotype was at that point. Okay, obviously, your genetic makeup determines the way you look. I agree with that. This is a category of reality. Whiteness is a category of the mind. It is a political characterization, a political category that gets imposed on people for political purposes, and this was the situation in Virginia. No one in Germany at that time was white. because in order to be white, you had to be in contact with black people. And that's precisely what happened in Virginia when the African slaves met up with the Irish and Scottish slaves. So I agree, okay, that there is a genotype, that there is a biological determination in the human being created by God that creates your appearance. I agree with that. I am not disputing that. It's when you take a phenotype and turn it into some type of meaning, some type of, what should I say, identity, okay? Phenotype is not the basis of an identity, okay? Language is the basis of identity, and you consistently confuse these two terms. We cannot come to any understanding if you're going to consistently talk about race in this double meaning, kind of both sides of the street. Whiteness is based on phenotype. Phenotype does not determine identity, period.
I don't think anyone has ever argued that phenotype determines identity. When you speak of someone as white, there are a number of ways you could approach this. One, you could say that at some point historically, there was a first man who was called white. But there was also a first man who was called German, Deutsch, whatever it happens to be, because those terms came into being at some point historically. And so, yes, of course, there was some point at which they were first used. That doesn't actually mean anything. It just means that the term was used to reference the existing reality, the pre-existing reality. In this case, white just means European. That's all it means. It means a son of Japheth. That's what white means. And so to say that we use the term white and that it's a matter of phenotype, that's not what is being referenced there. What is being referenced there is the underlying racial reality. We just happen to use the term white now. We could have said European. Part of the reason that it was used was exactly what you said. It was in contrast to those who are black. We could have said European versus African. It would have been the same thing. There's no difference there. Just because we're using something that references the phenotypical expression of the genotype doesn't mean we're referencing the phenotype itself ultimately. We're referencing the underlying genetic reality. And I'm also going to take issue with the fact that you said that they didn't know anything about genotype, because that's just not true. Our ancestors were already selectively breeding plants and animals. They understood full well how this stuff worked. They may not have known the microscopic inner workings of it yet because they couldn't view that, mostly. Granted, that goes back farther than most men believe. But they still understood what was happening. They bred certain forms of domestic cattle in order to have certain traits. They understood how these things worked. And of course, everyone knows how this works. Because if you marry someone who's from your own race, your children look like you. If you marry someone who's from another race, your children don't look like you. Every man understands that. We all understand that there is this underlying reality, even if we can't explain the actual inner workings of it. It doesn't matter if we can explain the inner workings. We still don't know how gravity works. But if I drop something off my desk right now, I know full well it's going to hit the floor. It's due to gravity. I don't know how gravity works, and neither does a single living man on this planet, because we can't explain it, but it's still a reality. And so when you're dealing with these terms, like white or black, it is referencing a pre-existing reality. It is not creating something new, because man can't create in that way. We can't create the Germans. We can't create the French. We can't create the Africans. God created those things. We, to some degree, create terms to reference them. We don't create the underlying reality. And so calling ourselves white is not a problem. All we're doing is describing how we look with reference to what we are. I'm white because I am German. Americans are a white Germanic race. Everyone in Europe is white insofar as he is European. Those from Africa aren't white. Those from Asia aren't white. Jews, notably, are not white. They are a different thing. When we use the term white, we are referencing that racial reality, not simply how one looks.
There were no Germans, no German was white. No German was ever white. No European was ever white. The first European who became white was an Englishman in Virginia in the tobacco plantations. That's the first time the word got used to designate people. Now you keep switching horses in midstream. There's always this kind of shell game going on here when you're saying white is the underlying reality. Is that what you're saying? Are you saying white is the underlying reality that is more basic than, let's say, language or ethnicity?
No, I'm very clearly saying that white and European reference the same thing in the way that we are using the term and in the way that our ancestors were using the term for those laws.
It's not
because
so wait,
they would certainly
wait,
they would have excluded Middle Easterners as well. And there are some people from Libya and other parts of that region of the world who are very much white in appearance, lowercase w, uppercase W white. We are referencing the racial reality, the genetic reality. We are not referencing simply how one looks. There are plenty of Japanese who are very pale skinned. We would not call them white because they're not white. White means European, just as black means African. Even if there are very dark-skinned peoples in some other parts of the world, some of the Aborigines, for instance, in Australia, are very dark-skinned. We're not going to call them black because they're not black in the sense of being African. We would call them dark-skinned, certainly, but that is a separate thing. And this is not even new, because what does Ethiopia mean? It basically means burnt face. It means someone who has dark skin. References to the appearance of certain peoples has been a part of human culture for as long as we can trace back, because it makes sense. What is one of the first things you see about another man when you meet him? You see his race, because you can see his race in his face. And it's not just the color of his skin. It's the orientation of the features. It's the separation of the eyes. It's the relation of the eyes to the nose. It's the shape of the nose. It's how the eyes relate to the ears. All of these things are a function of the underlying genetic reality. And you can see a man's face and you can tell what race he is because it is a fundamental part of nature. God designed us that way, and we cannot ignore it.
Okay, we keep going around in circles here, okay? I agree that there is a biological determination of how I look. I agree that there is a biological determination of phenotype. But you keep engaging in the sleight of hand here. It's a shell game here. And you start saying the underlying reality when what you're talking about here is you're saying that phenotype is identity. We have to use these terms. You have to be honest about what you're doing.
No, I've been abundantly clear that it is genotype.
All right, then genotype is the source of identity.
Hey, guys.
Correct.
We are kind of going in circles here on the semantics issue.
Good.
I know it's important, but I also know we're limited on time. If possible, I would really like to hear more, and I think people want to hear more about how white unity pertains to Scripture. If we can just agree that European people are white for the sake of the discussion, maybe we can move on.
I can't agree to that. That is not true. That is fundamentally not true. That is the whole game here. You're using this shell game to shoehorn a term into Europe that didn't exist until the 16th century. This is precisely the issue here. You cannot do this shell game here.
So just to maybe ask a question, is your issue not really with like European unity? It's just more with the semantics that we use to talk about this?
There is one source of European unity, and it is the Catholic Church, period. There is no other source of European unity. And to say that Europeans are white is preposterous. No one was white before the Virginia colony in the 17th century. No one was white before that.
Okay, but then by the same token, no one was German until the Romans started using that term, because, of course, German comes from the Latin, not from the German, which doesn't follow, because words don't determine reality. That's not how that works. God's words do, because God's speech is performative. Man's speech is not performative. Man's speech is descriptive. And so just because we started using the term white doesn't mean that the underlying reality referenced by the term did not pre-exist the term itself, and certainly the usage of the term, because white existed before that. The color exists.
Phenotype preceded white. I agree with that.
It's referencing the genetic reality. Again, when we're using it, we're just
Pheno-
using
phenotype
white and
preceded-
European equivalently.
No, I
They're
agree with
equivalent.
you. I'm agreeing with you. Phenotype preceded the use of the term white. I agree with that.
Okay, for the sake of moving the discussion forward, let's say European unity instead of white, because what term we use doesn't really matter. The underlying reality is what matters. What we're attempting to build, what we're attempting to do is what matters. And so is Christianity compatible with European unity? And in that, I obviously include Americans as part of European stock because we are descended from Europeans. Again, we are an Anglo-Saxon country with Celtic admixture, as we both fully well know, since we both have Celtic admixture in our blood.
There is one source of European unity, and it's the Catholic Church. It was broken by the Reformation, but the only thing that created unity out of the warring tribes in Europe was the Catholic faith.
I would have to disagree with that because we have centuries of established Lutheran churches in Germany and in the Scandinavian countries where they were still very much unified. And so you did
Wait a
not
minute.
have, you didn't have the Roman Catholic
the very-
Church in that case.
The very fact that they're Lutheran churches means the Reformation destroyed the unity of Europe.
No, I disagree because you still have unity, at least with regard to Northern Europe. Whether or not Southern Europe elected to remain Roman Catholic doesn't change the fact that you still had certainly Germanic unity, which incidentally, you can see the fault line there. How did it break? It broke along racial lines because by and large, the Germanic countries went Protestant. By and large, the non-Germanic countries did not because the Slavs stayed Orthodox, whereas the Italics, the Spanish, and others stayed Roman Catholic. It broke along racial lines because these are the peoples who are descended from the grandsons of Noah. Germans have been German since Ashkenaz settled in Germany. That's how that
Look,
works.
I came from a Catholic region of Germany. Germany split right down the middle according to Catholic Lutheran distinction. There was
Yes,
no
Bavaria
race,
stayed Roman Catholic.
There's no racial difference here. If you're saying Germanic unity, that's an oxymoron because the very fact that you had a Germanic church meant that you broke from the universal church, which is headquartered in Rome. That was the Reformation was the destruction of European unity. And no amount, when Hitler came to power, okay, the one thing he understood was that he had to unite the German people. In order to do that, he had to take on the Reformation, and he failed. He could not resolve the Reformation. So what did he do? He created a fantasy world of pre-Christian Germany based on Wagnerian operas. That's what he had to do. It was a fiction. It was a fiction based on Wagnerian operas that could not surmount the real division that is in Germany, which is religious and not biological. Not biological, it's religious. Same thing at the time of Christ. The division between the Jews was religious and not biological.
A few points. First, I completely disagree with your characterization both of the Reformation, as I am Lutheran, and of Germanic unity, because I think it's completely and utterly ridiculous. We'll get to the Third Reich in a moment here. But the split between Bavaria and Northern Germany, yes, that was an intra-ethnic split. It was a split within the Germanic peoples. That's true. There are some differences because, again, you have a subgroup of Bavarians and a subgroup of Prussians and various other parts of Germany. Just the same as the subgroups in the United States are not identical. Southerners and Northerners and Midwesterners and those of us from California are not all exactly the same people. There are some subtle differences there because there are subgroups within races. Because how does it work? It's family, tribe, clan, nation. These groups go on and on and on. And eventually you get to the point of the human race where, yes, we're all related because we all descend from Adam and Eve. But with regard to your accusation that the Reformation split the church, you are begging the question. You're doing the exact same sort of thing that you do with the term white. You don't like the term, so you object to it. But you're doing the inverse of that now, the other side of the coin, where you beg the question by saying, well, because the church in Rome calls itself Catholic, It must therefore be universal, even though most men don't even remember that's the same word there. Because it calls itself the Roman Catholic Church does not in fact mean that it is Catholic. It is certainly Roman. It's located in Rome. I'm willing to grant that. But it's not Catholic. Because the universal church is something fundamentally different. Because the universal church is Christ's church. And Christ's church includes every single believer who has ever lived and who ever will live. And you know what? Your own church admits that, because your own church seated in Rome says there are Christians outside the Roman Catholic Church. And if there are Christians outside the Roman Catholic Church, then the church, universal, properly understood, is not limited to Rome. Adam and Eve were Christian. Adam and Eve were not Roman Catholic. Noah was a Christian. Noah was not a Roman Catholic. That is not how this works. That is not what Scripture says. That is just fundamentally at odds with reality. And with regard to the Reformation, what the Protestants wanted and what we pushed for many times, even after Rome resorted to force of arms, was an actual Christian council. It was incumbent on the Pope to call that, and he did not do so. He did not do his Christian duty. And so at that point, at the absolute best, he was derelict, and most likely it would be fair to say that he was apostate. And so no, the Roman Catholic Church is not the church. The Roman Catholic Church is a church. There are Roman Catholics who are good Christians. I expect to see many of them in paradise, but I also expect to see Presbyterians and Anglicans and Baptists and even some Orthodox, because they are also good Christians, many of them. And so the universal church includes them, but they are not part of Rome. And so Rome cannot be the Catholic Church in the proper understanding of Catholic. Rome is not what built European unity, because European unity depends on more than Rome. European unity requires European blood. It requires white unity. Because look at the rest of the world. Do you have unity with regard to South America? Do you have unity with regard to anywhere else that is Roman Catholic? You do not, because it is not the Roman Catholic Church that built unity in Europe. It was part of it. It played a role for centuries. Of course, I grant that. They were very good popes. Some of them understood what they were doing. Certainly the Medicis did not. But that was not sufficient. It was part of the equation, but you also needed the substrate that is European blood, because you needed that genetic component. You could never have built what Europe built in Africa, regardless of whether or not you had, wherever it would be seated at that point, probably not Rome, but the Roman Catholic Church could not build that in Africa, because Africans are not Europeans. They're a different race, because race matters. And so white unity, European unity, is more than the Roman Catholic Church. And certainly these days, the Roman Catholic Church is actually at odds with this. So if you want to take the position that European unity, that nationalism, that white unity is at odds with the Roman Catholic Church, I am willing to let you have that position. I am going to argue it is not at odds with Protestantism, because nationalism and Protestantism can walk hand in hand and arm, and we can actually accomplish the things that Rome wants to subvert.
Well, I think we've reached a point of agreement that white is incompatible with the Catholic Church, but it is perfectly compatible with the Lutheran Church, because it's a state church. And this is the natural result of this was the Deutsche Christen. The official Lutheran Church accepted the Arian laws that were propagated by Hitler, the Nuremberg laws. And this caused Dietrich Bonhoeffer to leave, okay? But then you've got a problem here. You have to be German in order to be a Christian, according to the Arian laws. Is that true?
I'm actually just going to stop you there because you're absolutely wrong. This may work with other men, but I'm actually the one who translated the 28 Theses of the German Christians, so I know exactly what they say. And no, they explicitly reject that there is a racial requirement to be a Christian. What they state is that in accordance with the Aryan paragraph, so-called, of the National Socialist government, it was permissible and appropriate, and in this case required, of the national church to require that those who held office in the national church could hold office in the state, which is to say they had to be German, which is entirely fine. There's no problem with that. You can have a national church. In fact, national churches work better. We still have national churches all over the place. This is particularly something you see among the Orthodox, but you even see it in Rome. Sometimes that's not so good these days, where Rome is permitting pagan rituals to come into the church in certain places. But there's nothing wrong with having a national church, because different races are going to express the Christian faith in different ways. That's not to say they're going to change core tenets of the faith, because you can't. You have to believe in Christ alone. You have to believe that he died on the cross. You have to believe that he rose again. You have to believe in all of the things that the creeds say. Of course, I would hope we agree on the creeds, and I think that we probably do. But you can still have a national church, because Germans are not going to worship in the same way as the French. And the French are not going to worship in the same way as the Italians. The Italians are more boisterous. That's not going to work for a German population. How the Africans work is not going to work for the Chinese, because race is real, and we are different peoples fundamentally. And so the churches should express that. And you know what? That actually works. That's how you end up with Christians. The church, when it moved northward into Europe, was Germanized. And so Germans became Christian by and large in much greater numbers and much more readily than other peoples, as opposed to what the Roman Catholic Church attempted to do in China and attempted to force European conventions on the Chinese. And how did that go? Disastrously. China is still by and large atheist because of that failure. You have to recognize these racial differences, or you are not going to be effective at evangelizing. You're not going to be effective at spreading the Christian faith, because you're ignoring a fundamental reality. Yes, Christianity is a fundamental truth, but it doesn't subvert reality. When you are justified, it does not destroy your nature, because you are still what God made you. And again, God made me an American. I can't become Ugandan or anything else, because I am fundamentally this.
Okay, how can you say that and say that the Reformation did not destroy European unity? You just contradicted yourself.
I completely disagree.
Explain why.
No,
you
I have
didn't
already explained it.
contradict
What
yourself.
destroyed European unity? We could have still had a version of the Holy Roman Empire. We could have remained in that sort of unity if the Pope had done his job. When there is that sort of major conflict with regard to doctrine,
Wait a minute.
the Pope is supposed to call a council. Did he call it? Did the Pope call a council?
Can I ask you a favor? We don't have a lot of time left. Can you give me short answers to short questions?
Sure. Did the Pope call a council?
No, wait a minute. Let's go back to the idea of Christian unity. How can you say that the Reformation did not destroy Christian unity?
Did the Pope call a council?
How can you say that the Reformation did not destroy European unity and how can you say that the state church is compatible with universality? It's not. What you had is the state church led to racism. That's precisely what happened over this period of time.
Racism isn't a thing. Racism is a nonsense term, initially used actually by the political right wing in France, but then very quickly adopted by Jewish communists. And so I am going to not use that term. It's not a sin.
Don't tell me I'm not allowed to use certain terms, okay?
I'm not. I'm saying you can use it. You can absolutely use it, but it's not Christian.
To say that the Hitler regime was not based on some type of racism is preposterous. That's what it is.
It depends on how you want to define racism. Are you saying it's a sin?
I never said anything about a sin.
Well, do you think it's a sin?
I said racism.
I'm asking, do you think it's a sin?
That's not what I brought up here.
Well, I'm asking you, do you think racism is a sin?
I brought up the fact that, all right, if you want to ask me, racism is incompatible with Catholicism. It's incompatible with the universal church. That is why I said that you can't be white and be Catholic. Now, you can be white and be Lutheran because that is not a universal church. It's a state church, and the state church led inexorably to racism in Germany. It's that simple. Lutheranism led to racism. The Deutsche Christen are proof of that.
If you'd like to take that position, I'm disinclined to argue against you, because if you want to say that the Roman Catholic faith is incompatible with nationalism, is incompatible with Europeans working toward their own interests, then so be it. You're saying the Roman Catholic Church is a roadblock on that. And if you're willing to say that, then what you're actually saying is the Roman Catholic Church is working to destroy the racial distinctions that God created, which means the Roman Catholic Church is wicked.
No, I'm saying ethnicity and Roman Catholicism. No, it's not the same. That's the whole point of the whole discussion we're having. It's not the same thing. Ethnicity is completely compatible with the Catholic faith, with the universal faith, but racism is not, because it's an ideology that is based on alien principles. You cannot have a you cannot have a racist universal church. The church has to be universal. If it's not universal, it is not the church that was founded by Jesus Christ. If it's a state church, it was founded by Luther, 1,500 years after Jesus Christ commissioned Peter to be the basis of the church. So it's a new edition that lost over a period of 500 years or 400 years, lost its identity and ended up emerging as a racial church.
Okay, here's point 4 from the German Christians. A people's church does not mean excluding Christians of other races from word and sacrament, or from the great Christian community of faith. A Christian of another race is not a lesser Christian, but rather a Christian of a different kind. Thus, the People's Church takes seriously that the Christian Church does not yet live in the perfection of divine eternity, but is bound by the orders God has given to this life. As I said, there's no exclusion of others from being Christian.
Accepts racial categories that contradict the universal church. Let's admit that.
Well, I completely disagree.
The basis of this,
we can get to Galatians 3:28 if you'd like.
The basis of this is the Aryan laws. The church capitulated to Hitler and the racial regime there. It did not remain faithful to the gospel, and that's why Dietrich Bonhoeffer had to break away from it.
Bonhoeffer was a heretic who denied the virgin birth and the resurrection of the body.
I am not defending Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
You've used him twice. You are defending him.
I just wrote an article in Culture Wars, and the title was "No Man Was More Justly Hanged Than Dietrich Bonhoeffer." So
then stop trying to use him as an example.
No, it's not an example. It's a fact.
You just said you said he had to leave the church. You're trying to say he's a good Christian, so he left the church that did this wicked thing.
I said he had to break with the church because the church, he was right in seeing...
He was a heretic.
You're not letting me finish the sentence here. He was right in seeing that the church, the Lutheran church, had capitulated to completely alien concepts that were completely alien to Christianity, which is by its nature a universal religion for all mankind. The Deutsche Christen had broken with that. They capitulated to Hitler's Nuremberg laws. By the fact that they
I literally just read the paragraph for you that refutes what you said.
By the fact that they were using these racial categories meant that they capitulated. They are completely alien to any true Christian sense. And the man who brought this out was Pius XI in his encyclical Mit brennender Sorge. This exaltation of the state and exaltation of race above Jesus Christ is alien to Christianity.
Then let me ask you a more fundamental question so we can see where the actual disagreement is here. The gangs in England that are Middle Eastern, I would say by race, perhaps you would say something else, are they ethnically British, in your view?
Why are you starting with the rape gangs? This is a loaded question. Let's go back.
Answer the question. Answer the question.
Let me reframe your question. I just interviewed a lady from Pakistan, okay, who was banned from the National Health Service because she started a Facebook page and she started criticizing the Israelis for genocide in Gaza. Okay, she was banned from the National Health Service. Nothing, no complaints about her medical treatment, anything like that. This lady had a degree from Cambridge and a PhD, another advanced degree. Now, the question is, can a Pakistani become an Englishman? This is a burning question in England right now because of the evaporation of the Protestant church as the established church, the evaporation of the English population, the collapse of the British Empire. This is a burning question. I am saying they've got to answer this right away. Though I'm saying any lady who has a degree from Cambridge University, who is working with the medical health service in England, is an English citizen and should not be considered a second-class English citizen. Period.
Okay, but you didn't answer the question. You didn't even answer your own question. Is she English?
Yes, she is.
So you're saying she's English?
Yes.
So
yes.
Ethnically English?
Yes. Of course she is.
Is she racially English? Would you go that far?
Well, there's your loaded question again. What does it mean to be racially English?
Well, I'm asking, in your system that you're constructing,
English is a language. It's not a race. English is a language.
Would you prefer that I use a people where those terms are distinct?
English is a language.
We can use Denmark and Danish if you don't like that they're the same word.
Okay, what's the difference? If you speak Danish, if you have a degree, if you have citizenship, if you have a passport, if you have an advanced degree from Cambridge University, you're English, period. And if they don't accept that, they may very well not accept that because of racial prejudice, in which case they will basically doom their country. That's the crisis in England.
Let me ask you a related question. Am I ethnically American or German? Ich kann Deutsch. Ich habe gewohnt in Deutschland. I have a degree from a German university, an advanced degree, since that seems to matter to you. I have a master's degree in law from a German university. Am I ethnically German or am I ethnically American?
You're an American.
Why am I an American?
Because you were born here, because you were raised here. We all come from someplace else, okay, traditionally. And the theory you need to understand about American ethnicity is the triple melting pot, which is basically where you come from various places in Europe. After 3 generations, you lose your language and religion becomes your ethnic identity in America. So you're a Protestant, I'm a Catholic. The triple melting pot is Protestant, Catholic, Jew. These are the 3 main ethnic groups in America. It's just like Yugoslavia, Serb, Croat, Muslim, 3 ethnic groups based on 3 religions. So you're a Protestant American. That's your ethnic identity.
Religion is not an ethnicity.
I never said it was. I never said it was.
You're trying to say that that's my ethnic identity is Protestant.
Except in America. America is different because
But it's not, because you can look at genetic studies and the American people, the American race is Anglo-Saxon with Celtic admixture. I've been very clear about that a number of times. The studies aren't even disputed. We know what it means to be an American. And incidentally, I don't think I would reference the melting pot that was written by a Zionist Jew.
Does that make it wrong?
It was used as propaganda to destroy the American race.
I said the triple melting pot. You're saying people don't assimilate here?
So if it's thrice, it's better? I think that's probably worse.
No, you come down to 3.
And no, people don't assimilate here. Could a Ugandan become American?
You don't. Well, look, one of the groups that's been here the longest is the Africans. The people from Africa.
And they're not American.
They've been here. You're saying black people are not Americans?
They are absolutely not.
Well, this is ridiculous.
They're not.
I think
they're African.
Okay.
You just said they're African. You recognize they're not American. You said they're African.
This is preposterous to say that black people are not American. They were here centuries before my people came here. They are Americans. And to deny that,
centuries before my people came here.
Only someone whose mind was crippled by racism could make a statement like that.
See, the problem is that you hold to this post-war consensus, this new global religion. You think that racism is some sort of heinous sin, and you think that racism is necessarily hatred for everyone else on the planet.
It's a descriptive. It's not prescriptive.
No, you are saying it's a sin because if you
I never said it was.
Would you like me to lay out the philosophical argument, because you made the argument, you just didn't reach the conclusion.
We have 1 minute to go here.
If it's incompatible with the church, it's sin.
Make your final statement.
If it's incompatible with the church, it's sin. And so you are saying that racism is sin. Racism is not sin. It's not found in Scripture. These categories are real. I said we could get to Galatians 3:28, and I will go over it briefly because it is vitally important here. The categories in Galatians 3:28 are real categories. They have to be real categories because if they're nonsense, the verse wouldn't mean anything. We'd be talking about Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky or something like that, using nonsense terms. And so when it says there is neither Jew nor Greek, It is speaking of race. It is speaking of racial realities. And those categories must be real because it is saying, with regard to inclusion in Christ, with regard to salvation for soteriological issues, race doesn't matter, which is exactly what the German Christians said as well. I read the paragraph for you that has that there. It's also in other paragraphs of those theses. Race does not matter with regard to salvation. You can be saved if you're Japanese, you can be saved if you're Ugandan, you can be saved if you're German or Scottish or American, whatever it happens to be. But race still matters because it's a fundamental thing. The same as what is the other pairing there. I mean, yes, you have slave and free, which is a hierarchical issue, but you have man and woman because man and woman are also biological genetic realities, the same as race. You cannot ignore these fundamental issues. You cannot ignore the way that God designed the world and not destroy the Christian faith and everything else with it. If you want to construct a Rome that says that race isn't real and goes for the melting pot and just dissolves all human distinctiveness into this brown sludge, then by all means, I am not joining you on that journey because you are destroying God's creation and you are blaspheming him in the process because you are telling him that he was wrong with the way that he made us because you want to destroy his creation. That is wicked. That is absolutely not something that we as Christians should be willing to do. And so if that's what Rome wants to do, then by all means, Rome can go ahead and try. But if Protestants are the ones that have to stand in the way of it, then by all means, we are the church. We are all that's left of the church.
Jew and Greek are ethnic groups. The Catholic Church, you keep confusing the two things. The Catholic Church is completely compatible with every nation on earth. It is not compatible with a racial ideology. Time's up. I got to go. Thanks for the discussion.